And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to support us financially, please feel free to hit that donate link. We'd greatly appreciate it. God bless.
Awesome. Okay, looks like we're live here, guys. This is going to be an exciting one. I know I'm looking forward to this one, and I know everybody in the audience is as well. So this is going to be one to remember. We've got two highly educated, very smart individuals, so we know that this is going to be an engaging debate. We have Ron, Garret, and Salvador here, who's blessed us with his, he's given us his time many times before. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us and giving us your time for this debate discussion.
Sure, thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
No problem, my pleasure. So it's gonna be kind of formal, informal tonight. We're gonna have 10-minute opening statements followed by 5-minute uninterrupted rebuttal rounds. And then the everybody's favorite part, of course, the discussion period. We've got 45 minutes, ending with 5-minute closing statements and a question and answer. So it looks like we're going to have a big audience tonight. So anybody who has questions, just please make sure you're either tagging myself or praise, so we don't miss the question, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible in the end. Whatever time the debaters don't use in the opening or even in the rebuttal round, we'll throw into the discussion, because as usual, I'm sure it's going to fly by. So enough for me. Before we go into the openings, I want to give both Ron and Sal here just a minute or so to kind of give us a brief introduction as to who they are, what they're doing, anything they want to tell us, just to kind of break the ice. So why don't we start with Ron? Go ahead.
So my name is Ron Garret. I have been studying the Bible for about 40 years and Young Earth Creationism for about 3. I started getting interested in this when I was 12 years old, and my parents sent me to a YMCA summer camp. I grew up in the South in Kentucky and Tennessee, the son of secular Jews surrounded by Southern Baptists. And at the Southern camp for 2 weeks, I was fairly relentlessly proselytized, and at the end of that time, I had a conversion experience and had what I described at the time as feeling the presence of the Holy Spirit. And it felt great. And I came home and told my parents that I was a newly minted Christian, and my dad said, "Great, then you should read the Bible." Which I did, and the more I read, the more convinced I became that this could not possibly be the word of an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent deity, and very quickly reverted back to atheism. But ever since then, I've just been really interested in trying to understand how people can believe these things that, to me, seem so clearly untrue. And a lot of atheists seem to be of the opinion that the only way that anybody could possibly believe these things is if you're stupid. And I've never believed that, because, all of my friends growing up were Christians, and a lot of them were clearly very smart, a lot of them smarter than me. And so I've just been trying to understand this stuff, and just found it very enlightening to work towards coming to an understanding of points of view that I don't believe with, and that I don't believe in. And so I've now spend some time on that. Professionally, I'm a software engineer by trade, so I happen to know a fair amount about information theory, which is why we're having this discussion.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much there, Ron. I really appreciate that introduction. We're happy to have you here. Sal, the floor is yours. Brief introduction.
I'm Salvador Cordova. I was a former scientist and engineer in the aerospace industry, aerospace and defense industry, and I presently work as a molecular biophysics research assistant for Dr. John Sanford. One of the reasons I'm here this evening is to discuss and debate some of the ideas that Dr. Sanford and I have been talking about for an upcoming set of books, including a revision to his 2005 genetic entropy hypothesis. And I feel very honored Dr. Garret would be reviewing some of our work. And just for the audience, I'd like to say Ron, I prefer to call him Dr. Garret personally,
Oh,
but
call me Ron.
Ron is the most Christian-like atheist I know as far as the ideas of kindness and charity. I have the privilege of attending a Bible study he leads as an atheist, through which I met both his mother and father and his family over the last few weeks. So it's an honor to share the stage with one of the most accomplished and intelligent people I've ever met. So a little bit of my experience in the church. Ron has probably studied creationism more than 99% of the people in my church. So even though he and I will sharply disagree, I'd rather be criticized than ignored at this point, because so many decades of my life I've been, my work on creationism has actually been ignored. So my present focus on Dr. Sanford's team, he has lots of people that do genetics, and a lot of people don't know he's president of Logos Research Associates, and there are like 200 researchers there. So there's lots of geneticists and people in other specialties. My specialty is in protein molecular biophysics. So the angles I'll take this evening on genetic entropy will not be exactly what you will have seen in his book that was written in 2005. So I'm looking forward to sharing tonight some angles you've probably not heard of genetic entropy.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that introduction as well, Sal. Like I said, we're extremely excited for this debate. Our channel is no stranger to genetic entropy. So yeah, this is going to be exciting. So why don't we get right into the opening statements then? We've got 10 minutes. I believe we agreed. Sal, were you going to go first?
Yes, I'll go first. Ron and I agreed on that. And if I run over, feel free to just cut me off, because
Sure.
I probably will go over. And
No problem.
I want to be fair to my counterpart here this evening.
I'll give you a 2-minute warning when we reach the 8-minute mark, just so you know to maybe start slowing down and wrapping up, and then yeah, we'll be good. You take your time. Looks like your screen is shared, so I'll start the timer whenever you're comfortable and good to go, Sal.
I think we're good to go. Genetic entropy, it may mean different things to different people, including Dr. Sanford's own research assistant. I may even take it differently than he does. So the way I represent it may not necessarily be the way he represents it. The way I focus on it is the human race is deteriorating. Each generation on average will be a little less medically fit than the previous generation. There will be more heritable diseases and birth defects with each generation. The human race may go extinct a lot sooner than we think. And to me, this suggests that we were created rather than evolved. Just briefly, the difference between intelligent design versus creationism. Intelligent design, the claim of intelligent design is that features of the universe and life are designed like a machine or a watch. Creationism, on the other hand, says life and the universe are intelligently designed, but also cursed and in need of a savior, Jesus Christ. The theory of genetic entropy echoes these themes. As I mentioned, this debate is partly to get editorial review for some books that are tentatively planned, and I'd like to thank Ron for his expert free of charge editorial review that he's providing for my ideas. I will frame genetic entropy a little bit different than you may have seen it in Dr. Sanford's book, and Dr. Sanford and I have been talking about this and we're bouncing around the idea. I'm going to frame genetic entropy in terms of hardware, that is chemistry, physics, structural biology, rather than software, like information and programming and software. So the 2005 book tended to focus on information. And also, Dr. Sanford framed genetic entropy in terms of the fitness as defined by population geneticists. I'm going to frame it in fitness defined by physicists and engineers in terms of physics and mechanics, rather than reproductive advantage, which I will claim is a silly metric for evaluating machines anyway. And life is composed of machines, at least according to biologists. That's the metaphor of choice, such as in Bruce Albert's book, Essential Cell Biology. So how literally we take that, maybe it's not worth debating, but that is the metaphor. That is the word that even biologists themselves, eminent ones like Alberts, have chosen. And as far as defining fitness in terms of reproductive advantage, I'll quote Lewontin from the Santa Fe Bulletin 2003. He said, "The problem is that it is not entirely clear what fitness is. Darwin's sense of fit has been completely bypassed." So a lot of people don't know that his theory, the definition of fitness, is slowly, quietly collapsed in evolutionary biology. So this is kind of a lead-in, a segue into an alternative definition of fitness that Dr. Sanford and I have proposed, and we're still thinking of different terms. It was inspired by William Bielek. He's a Princeton biophysicist. He's an elite National Academy of Science scientist. At the Hans Bethe Memorial Lecture at Cornell, he said, "Life is more perfect than we imagined." That's a shocking statement, given that biology is so full of death and disease and fragility. But echoing Bielek's views, other physicists have echoed the same thing, biophysicists. And in the New York Times article, it said, "Biological systems are optimized to the highest possible peaks of performance, the legal limits of what Newton, Maxwell, Pauli, Planck, et Albert will allow. In each instance, biophysicists have calculated the system could not get faster, more sensitive, or more efficient without first relocating to an alternate universe with alternate physical constants." So perfection is in the eye of the beholder. So I'm going to try to at least elucidate kind of what physicists are saying when they say perfection. Something cannot be more precise in quantifying classes of matter than counting molecules. That's pretty precise if we're trying to quantify how much of something we have. In terms of smell, we can smell. There are creatures that can smell an individual molecule. We can't build detectors more sensitive or more precise than sensing individual molecules or counting photons. This is all in Bielek's book, by the way. Sharks can sense electric fields at the limit of physics, as in nanovolts per meter. They can remotely sense electric fields from the muscle contractions of its prey. That's just phenomenal. Any electrical engineer working in the field knows that this is phenomenal. They ought to be bewildered by this. Birds use quantum spin chemistry and the cryptochrome system to measure magnetic fields. They can navigate from north to south annually. The Arctic tern does that. Insect eyes are optimized for focus in terms of, as far as perfect, defined by geometric optics. There's homochirality, homolinkage, minimized entropy, and we can't get more minimal than that. This goes into stereochemistry. That's really technical. Also, some of the hearing mechanisms in creatures, they can detect angstrom to sub-angstrom vibration sensing. They can sense a molecule moving like half the size of a molecule. It's incredible, or half the size of an atom. Parts are machined to angstrom to sub-angstrom precision, often beyond what scientists can achieve. So that's kind of a qualitative view of what they mean by perfection, and I will illustrate this. This is a protein here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. This is a protein called a potassium ion channel, potassium channel. And this is one depiction of it. And you could see here this little green blob is a potassium ion going through this potassium ion channel. And this is a top view. And this is from an educational video, the potassium going through this channel. And you'll notice it says perfect fit, perfect fit. So first off, I'll give a different perspective, a slightly different view of the same potassium channel. And maybe in the Q&A, if people are interested, I have a video of this. But let me show something interesting. You could see here the size of the potassium ion here, and you can contrast it with the sodium. And you could even see, like, between the sodium and calcium ions, there's like 0.03 angstroms in difference. These proteins can discriminate between all of these, even though they're very slightly different in size. Now, we would think, oh, it's no big deal to have a hole and just let a molecule flow through it. Well, we would get that impression because we drill through wood and we have laser cutting and sanding. We can't, that will not work at the molecular level. To be able to do this, you can't drill a hole. There's no machinery that will let you do that. So how are we able to achieve this feat? Or how does biology achieve that feat? It's through spelling. Spelling defines the size and shape and function of the protein. And this is the spelling of the protein in terms of its amino acids. So each of these English alphabetic letters correspond to one of the 20 amino acids. I highlighted this red area that's really critical. This cannot change without killing the potassium channel. Some of the other parts can suffer a little bit of damage, but not much. But spelling is important for defining size and shape. And I'm trying to share with creationists, stop using the word information. We can argue hardware, not software, because when we argue information, it just gets into all sorts of trouble. So when we spell things a certain way, how do we know how it's going to fold? Well, actually, that's the problem. We don't know. We couldn't take a spelling of a protein and figure out how it's going to be shaped. That's what they call the protein folding problem. It's from the dictionary. It just shares this is one of the main unsolved problems in molecular biology. But there's an even harder problem. Let's say you wanted to build something. How would you spell it so that it's shaped right and does the right things? That's the harder protein. We don't know how to do that. Even with our best supercomputers and scientists, we can't solve this. On the right there is a picture of the young John Sanford, who was a genetic engineer. But he, who's one of the preeminent in his day genetic engineers, didn't actually create new genes. He was just transplanting them. So that's just giving an idea of how difficult it is. So how do these proteins interact? How do we define some of their interactions and how they connect? You could see here that we have like a shape of a protein on the right in the dark green and then another one on the light green. Ideally, when they connect, the plus charges and minus charges will line up and you'll get a nice connection in addition to the shape. This is from Bruce Albert's book, Essential Cell Biology, and I'll explain what these things are a little bit later. These are the amino acids, and they have these little colored blotches here on the amino acids, or what are called R groups.
You got just under a minute, Sal, just under a minute.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to have to skip, but this is the way that we can define how precisely something has to fit. That is the new definition of fitness. So what one can see is when we deviate from this, and let me see if I could just flip a little bit to this distribution. I hope it's clear now why this distribution, in fact, this was generous. Because if something is perfectly fit, it's very hard for it to be modified without causing a failure in function. So with that, I'll off to Ron. Thank you.
Awesome. And I have to point out the fact that my fault, you went for 11 minutes. I forgot to give you that minute warning before the 10-minute mark. So Ron, you, to be fair, of course, you get up to 11 minutes as well.
I demand equal time.
Equal time is given to you.
Well, Sal, you've convinced me. I just don't know any way to rebut that. I am now a Young Earth Creationist. Praise Jesus.
All right, debate over. Let's go home, guys.
No, no, you have not convinced me. You have, however, taken me a little bit by surprise because I mean, I sort of knew that all this information was out there, but I haven't really looked into any of it except for Sanford's book, and I thought that's what we were here to talk about. And you've just thrown a lot of new stuff at me that I haven't really prepared to discuss. So I'm going to have to just kind of shoot from the hip here. One of the things that I've noticed about creationist arguments in the years that I've been following them is, ironically, that they evolve. There seems to be fashionable trends. So, for example, there was a time when you'd hear a lot about crocoducks, and if we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? And those arguments seem to have fallen out of favor. And genetic entropy has kind of taken over as one of the arguments that is currently fashionable. And it goes back to 2005 and has been criticized to some degree, including by me. And now you can see the argument evolving. Whoops, I just lost my screen. Am I still connected? Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Wow, that was really weird. My entire screen just went black for about 5 seconds, and now it's back. Maybe it was a sign from God.
It could be, but you're good. We can see you, Ron.
Where was I? Yeah. So now there's these this argument seems to be evolving in real time. So for example, the definition of fitness has changed. You're talking about hardware versus software. What else? Talking about the optimization of biological systems to the highest level of performance. These are they sound like new arguments to me. I don't recall any of that appearing in Sanford's book. Now maybe it was there and I missed it, but it's possible that these arguments are valid. I don't know because I haven't studied them. What I do know is that if Darwin's definition of fitness has changed among the people who defend evolutionary theory, that's news to me. And if that were really true, that would that would be big news. That would essentially overturn the entire theory, because the definition of fitness as reproductive fitness is really core to the theory. So if you're going to redefine fitness, we're not really talking about evolution anymore. At least we're not talking about the evolution that I have come here prepared to defend. So we can have a discussion about this new definition of fitness and talk about like whether this is useful for anything. But if you're going to redefine a term, we're going to be clear that we're no longer talking about the same thing. We're just using an old familiar word to mean something new, and that can get very confusing. And I've noticed this happen. Young Earth Creation is doing this with other words, and in particular, Sanford did it with the word information. So the word information has a well-established technical meaning. There's an entire field of study called information theory that was invented by Claude Shannon in 1948. And it's pretty well established and understood now. And one of the things I criticize Sanford's book for is that he exhibits no apparent understanding or even awareness of this in his book. He doesn't even mention it. He doesn't reference Shannon at all. So it's kind of hard to tell whether what he's talking about when he talks about information is what Shannon is talking about, or whether he's talking about something new, because he never really defines it. He kind of sort of does. He has this woolly definition back in the glossary. But that is one of the core reasons why I think his argument, to put too fine a point on it, has no merit. How much time do I have left?
You've got 6 minutes, Ron.
Oh, okay, so I will briefly address this issue of hardware versus software. So you brought this up. This is entirely new to me. I've never heard anyone in the creationist community mention this before. But I will say that, again, one of the fundamental advances in computer science was Alan Turing's 1936 paper, which for the first time proved the universality of a particular computational model, the Turing machine, which is the reason that the Turing machine is a big deal. Everyone's heard of Turing machines. It's this machine that can go back and forth on a tape and write ones and zeros. And of course, we don't build computers that way, except as sort of a gag. You can actually go on YouTube and find videos of actual Turing machines that are built this way. There's even one built out of wood, which is kind of cool, but nobody uses these to do any real work. And the reason for that is that the point of the Turing machine is not that building a machine in this way is a good idea, but that building a machine in this way allows it to be universal. And if it's universal, then the reason that's important is up until that point, the machines that humans had built to do computations were hardware that were specific to a particular task. There were machines that did astronomical calculations, and there were machines that calculated logarithms. And every one of these machines had a different design, had to be fabricated differently. And the cool thing about a Turing machine is, because it's universal, it's the last machine you ever have to build. Once you build a Turing machine, it can do anything. And all you have to do is program it. All you have to do is write ones and zeros on the tape. So Turing essentially invented software. That's the reason that he's famous. And nowadays we build Turing machines out of transistors and memories out of transistors rather than tapes. But that was the whole point of Turing's paper. That's the reason it was such a big breakthrough, is that there really is no difference between hardware and software, that there is a certain level of complexity in your hardware that you get to, at which point everything becomes software. And the other interesting thing about that is that the level of complexity that you have to get to is very low. It's just not that hard to build a Turing machine, a machine that is computationally complete. In fact, it's actually hard. It's harder to build a machine that's not computationally complete, or to design a programming language that's not computationally complete, than it is to design one that is. And this is important because if you have something that's computationally complete, it's hard to analyze. There are certain things you can prove that you can never prove about it. Like you can never prove that a program that's running on a Turing machine is free of bugs. Whereas, so if, for example, you're running software, an expensive asset like a spacecraft, that might be important to you. And so you might actually want a computational piece of computational hardware that's not computationally, analyze it and prove that it's not going to crash your spacecraft. So although I have not heard the details of this argument, based on what I do know about the fundamentals, my guess is that you're going to find that it's a dry well. Since I have a little bit of time, let me just say a couple of things about the things that we actually do agree on. Life is extraordinarily complicated. And it is to some extent fine-tuned, and that is an interesting phenomenon that demands explanation. But the reason that Darwin gets all the attention is because up until Darwin, everyone was a creationist. There was just no other plausible explanation on the table other than that we were created, and at that point, obviously we had to have been created by a deity, because intelligent aliens were not really on the table as a theory either. And by the way, the hypothesis that we were designed by intelligent aliens is one that I think is a perfectly respectable scientific hypothesis, and one that I'm willing to seriously consider if you show me some evidence for it. No, you laugh, but I'm serious. This is all of the arguments that I've heard so far, all of the arguments for intelligent design that I've ever heard, lend as much support to the intelligent alien designer as they do to the deity designer. I've not heard, and I've never seen any argument against the for ID that tilts that in one direction or the other. Maybe there is one, I just haven't heard it. Maybe you can enlighten me tonight. So with that, I guess I will yield back the balance of my time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to both Sal and Ron there. Very clear and concise opening presentation. So I appreciate that. Yeah, we've got just over a minute we can throw into the discussion period. Before we get to the discussion, though, we do have a couple short 5-minute uninterrupted rebuttals. So I'm going to hand it over to Sal. Sal, on your first word, I will. You can go with your rebuttal. I'll give you a 1-minute warning. This time I really will, but I got to be strict on these rebuttal rounds. So go ahead, Sal.
First off, I'm totally fine if Ron wants to interrupt me. We're very conversational, and it also, if he has something to say, I think it'll help clarify. He's very fine gentleman. So,
well, what we'll do is, as moderator, I won't allow any interruptions just during the 5-minute rebuttals.
Okay.
So if there is something he needs to clarify or something you need to clarify, save that for the discussion. That's why we got a 46-minute discussion. So any clarifications can take place in the discussion. So go ahead, Sal, whenever you're ready.
First off, I read Ron's article, and that actually motivated me to bring this on the table because there are things that when Dr. Sanford, I helped him arrange his talk at the NIH, and afterward he came over to my house and he stayed with my family, and I said, John, I said, is it okay for me to criticize you publicly? I mean, given that I work for you? He said, yeah, that's all right. Just so what is it? I said, I have problems with the way you define information. I said, we're not going to agree. I said, John, this is my specialty. Being an electrical engineer, computer science guy, that's something I had to learn. I studied Shannon's theorems at the graduate level. I also studied thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. Are you thinking about having a 5th edition for your genetic entropy? It's actually gone through 4 editions quietly. There have been minor just corrections. I said, John, can you just, if we go through a 5th edition, can you let me rewrite that 1 page? You can just fix a lot of problems if we can, because you're just making yourself vulnerable to this. And then this January, we had discussions about this problem with fitness. Because we submitted a paper to, we were actually invited by an editor to submit ideas to a peer-reviewed prestigious journal because they had more downloads for their paper on Fisher's theorem than any other paper in that journal, and they wanted us. So we reviewed the whole thing about fitness, and I found all these things that showed fitness. The idea of fitness is collapsing. So I didn't mean to totally blindside Ron here. It was mostly that this was, I was going to just throw this on. This was an opportunity for me to throw these ideas out in the public sphere and see how people would react to it. Because that's really part of my job, to try to make the best book possible. So Ron's critique, I felt, was actually very accurate on many levels, and I felt it had to be addressed. And so when he told me that he was reading Genetic Entropy, I was almost horrified. I wanted to tell him, hey, Ron, that's not the latest and greatest stuff. This. But
why didn't you tell me? You should have told me. Sorry to interrupt.
I should have. Okay. So, it was not, it wasn't because I was trying to embarrass you or anything. I was just,
I'm sure that wasn't your intent.
Yeah. So, because I was like, nah, he's not going to bother to read it. He read it. I'm just like, oh no, I was hoping to get my book out first before he could critique that. So anyway, thank you for reading that book. That's more than I could say for a lot of people in my church, which is really sad. So thanks.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah. If we wanted to kind of go more informal now, Ron, we can give you as much time as you need here, because Brother Sal only used a few minutes there of uninterrupted time, and then we'll just jump right into the discussion. So then you guys can ask each other questions, clarify, whatever kind of makes this discussion the easiest.
Yeah, there's not much to rebut there. Let's see. We should probably start disagreeing about something, or this is going to get kind of boring. So let me make a couple of more high-level observations about the reasons that I have observed discussions between young Earth creationists and atheists run off the rails. One of them is that there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding about the nature of the scientific process, the actual claims of evolutionary theory, the distinction between evolution and abiogenesis, and a lot of the fundamentals about information theory and computer science. So we can get, I'm happy to get deeply into the technical weeds on any of these things, but just sort of in broad brushstrokes, the worldview that I subscribe to is I subscribe to Karl Popper's theory of how the scientific process is supposed to work. I subscribe to Darwin as clarified by Dawkins. So one of the tactics that I see used a lot is trying to poke little holes in evolutionary theory, saying, here's a problem with the implied conclusion that because there is this problem, the whole theory must be wrong and is just going to come apart at the seams. It's true that there are problems with evolutionary theory, have been historically problems with evolutionary theory, still are problems with evolutionary theory, but that is the normal course of events in the scientific process. All scientific progress begins with a problem, begins with somebody saying, here is something that our current best theories do not adequately explain. And then the process proceeds from there by people brainstorming possible solutions to this problem. They're called hypotheses. And then they argue about it and they eliminate some of these hypotheses on various grounds, mainly that they don't accord with previously known results. Usually at the end of that process, there's only one left standing. The case where there's more than one, then we do experiments in order to eliminate until we only have one. And then the whole process starts over again. So there are always problems. So the mere existence of problems is not enough to call an entire theory into question. In particular, creationists do not seem to have taken adequate note of Richard Dawkins' selfish gene theory that he published in 1976. So up until that point, there was one of the problems in evolutionary theory was, does evolution select for individuals or groups? And there was a lot of debate about this. And the answer turns out to be neither. Evolution selects for genes, and in particular, it selects for the reproductive fitness of genes in particular environments. And all of the words in that slogan are really significant and have some very profound implications that I don't think are widely appreciated, and we can get into some of those details. And then the last thing is the difference between evolution and abiogenesis. These are often conflated by creationists, because creationists often raise what I call arguments from incredulity. They will point to something that is just so ridiculously complicated that they can't possibly see how it could have arisen by, and the straw man is random chance. And there's this argument that you don't see that much anymore because it's fallen out of favor because it's now widely recognized as a straw man, but the tornado assembling the 747. Because everybody agrees, obviously a tornado can't assemble a 747. If a tornado rose through a junkyard full of parts, the result will not be anything resembling a working machine of any kind. But that's not how evolution works. Evolution has a random component, but then a random mutation, but it also has a non-random component of selection. And that's crucial, and that is ignored by the tornado assembling the 747 argument. But that's evolution. There's also the question of how the whole process got started, and that's abiogenesis. And that science has a much more tenuous grasp on. We're making progress, but we still don't have anywhere near as good a story to tell about abiogenesis as we do about evolution. The case for evolution is pretty rock solid. The case for abiogenesis still leaves some room for doubt. And personally, I believe in abiogenesis, but I concede that that is an article of faith on my part. I'll give you long odds that we'll eventually figure it out, but the fact of the matter is we have not yet figured it out. And it's possible that the end result of that is that we were seeded from some intelligent alien seeding life on Earth. It's entirely possible. Again, I'll give you long odds against. But you can't eliminate that possibility on the data that we have today. So I think I've probably used up my 5 minutes there.
Yes, yes, and both of you, once again, clear and concise. Thank you for those rebuttals. So let's get right into the discussion then, the fun part. I've got nearly, let me see here, about 50 minutes on the clock. So let's make this fun. Sal, since Ron just finished his rebuttal, why don't we start with you? If you have a question or a point that you know Ron will disagree with you on, let's try and stick to that which you guys disagree on. Why don't we start there? Thanks, and Sal, it's all yours, brother.
Just to liven this up, just take a little break. I'm going to just derail the conversation a little bit because I have a little backstory. This Saturday at a Bible study, someone was who went to Liberty University saw Ron Garret in her class, and he was speaking at the Jet Propulsion Lab for Google, and he had some very interesting things to say about information theoretic, his views. And I was curious if his views changed and how that relates to God, because the reason they showed that at Liberty University, which is a Young Earth Creation University, so Ron's getting more press there than I am. And they were presenting that as an evidence for God. So I'm sorry to just throw this as a side, but you have some very interesting viewpoints. And
so just for the sake of historical accuracy, that talk was not given at the Jet Propulsion Lab. That talk was given at Google as a Google Tech Talk.
Okay.
In 2012, I think it was, and I had long since left JPL at that point, so nothing to do with the JPL. But that talk is about quantum mechanics. If the audience is interested, the title of the talk is The Quantum Conspiracy. It's on YouTube, so just search for The Quantum Conspiracy and you'll find it. So quantum mechanics is another thing that I study as a hobby, and but that will take us very far afield if we get into that.
Okay. Well. Thank you. I'll look into it, and I just wanted to say that seemed very prominent. I thought that was
also, just for the record, there is actually a fair amount of parallel between the nature of the quantum wave function and the way that Christians think about God. And maybe we can talk about that someday, but that's really
okay.
Severe tangent for what
I think that would be a good future talk. Let's and I really appreciate that story, Sal. Let's try, because we're down to, let's just make sure that the 50 minutes is on topic. Questions, rebuttals from each other, and challenges to each other's positions. So Sal, if you got a question or a challenge or point you want to make to Ron, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Sure. I actually think Richard Dawkins' ideas, they're generally laughed at even by professional biologists like E.O. Wilson, and that's why we also have the third wave of evolution that is rejecting classical Darwinism, and that's why they're also having this idea that neo-Darwinism is collapsing. There needs to be a new synthesis. One of the challenges is that we tend to think that natural selection, natural as in what happens in nature, that we model it correctly with genetic algorithms. And that's where I think there's really a problem, because with genetic algorithms, we can try to, just like that ion channel that I was showing earlier, that potassium ion channel, we can run that in a genetic algorithm simulation, and there's really no creature that dies. And we can try to build that ion channel, even though we don't quite know how to do protein folding yet. But let's say hypothetically we could just run it through there. In a real organism, one might only get a few shots at it. It's just not going to keep iterating at the organism.
I'm allowed to interrupt at this part, right?
Of course. We just want to keep it an organic, free-flowing dialogue. So anytime you want to interrupt, Ron, go ahead.
I'm happy to stipulate that there are mutations that will kill an organism. If that's what you're trying to get at.
No, I was saying that there'll be mutate. Well, that'll be one, but then there are others where it's not going to be. My main point is the genetic algorithm is not an appropriate model of how nature really works. That's
okay,
maybe
but I didn't say that it was, and Dawkins never said that it was. So let's actually back up a step. You said
Sure.
Dawkins is generally laughed at. That's an argument from authority. You're saying there are smart people out there laughing at Dawkins, therefore Dawkins is wrong, right? Is that a fair paraphrase of the point you were trying to make there?
Maybe I didn't have much of a point except to say that he's not regarded as an authority in evolutionary biology. That's what I mean, I would not cite him as an authority on evolutionary biology.
Okay, but I would.
Okay.
So I'm not a biologist.
Okay.
I don't keep up with the latest developments in biology. I don't know the politics. All I know is that I read Dawkins' book and I found it very convincing, and I am prepared to defend his thesis on its merits if you want to tell me why people are laughing at it, and maybe you'll persuade me that I should be laughing at it too. But
Sure.
I don't know. I neither know nor care if some people are laughing at it. People have laughed at all kinds of things that have ultimately turned out to be true. So the mere fact that people are laughing, that's neither here nor there.
Well, I think the reason I brought it up is both his peers and seniors on his side of the argument, meaning other biologists who study evolution, the fact that they look down on him, I began looking into it, and those are actually some of the same people that John Sanford appealed to in his book, Quietly, in his book. So when we talked to a lot of...
But did you listen to any of them explain why they're laughing at him and internalize their arguments to the point where you can reproduce, where you can restate them here?
Yes, most molecular evolution, just as a matter of principle, has to be neutral. We can, as Haldane said, you can't select for everything simultaneously. There's situations.
And Dawkins acknowledges that, and he talks about that extensively. And if you want, I can recapitulate
I'm glad you picked up on it, and I think you're representing him maybe better, more charitably than I would. So,
I'm not being charitable. I can cite you literally chapter and multiple chapters where he talks about this exact problem and acknowledges it as a problem and presents the solution to the problem. So yes, you're right. Evolution can only select at the individual level, and this is a problem. Like I said, this is how science proceeds. And this is the reason, by the way, that Dawkins is famous, is because this is a very hard problem to solve, and he solved it. He's not famous for being an atheist. He's famous for solving this problem.
And that's not, and you'll have to forgive me. See, I've actually read a little bit more literature from his critics on the evolution side, not creationist side, because it relates to Kimura's neutral theory. There was a big argument how much selection plays a role in the evolution of genomes or molecular. And so for the readers out there, if they Google Kimura's neutral theory, the hypothesis is that the large majority of molecular evolution has been neutral. And that's even carried over to now what they're calling morphological. So kind of the sentiment then is that
Dawkins wouldn't deny that, by the way, that the vast majority of molecular mutations are neutral.
And then the question is how much complexity, how many complicated organs, as Darwin said, organs of extreme perfection and complication, how much of that can actually evolve? Because if you look at, that's why the question of ENCODE and the functionality of the 3.3 gigabases in the human genome is a big issue. Yes,
indeed. It's a very hard problem.
It's a hard problem.
This is the reason Dawkins is famous for solving it.
I don't think he's solved it.
Okay, why not?
And
why not?
Because I think neutral theory is. I've never heard anyone in on the evolution side ever cite him for having solved the problem of like what we have with the function of encode.
Have you actually read The Selfish Gene?
I have not. That's the other thing. So
you should.
Oh boy, I'm so tired of reading evolutionary literature. I do prefer reading. I prefer.
No,
reading
I get that too.
Yeah,
I'm tired of reading creationist literature.
Okay.
and that's why I'm very selective about what I read. And the reason I read Genetic Entropy is because you endorsed it, and you really impressed me as somebody who knew their shit. You seem to have a much better grasp on a lot of the basics of science and engineering and information and all that than your typical creationist. And the fact that you were endorsing this book is what drew me to it, because that's what made me think that there might actually be a worthwhile argument there. And I was surprised and disappointed when there wasn't. It was just transparently naive. But one of the things that I really firmly believe is that you ought not to criticize an argument unless you actually understand the argument.
Oh, no, I think you made a fair point, and I'm going to have to, since you suffered through genetic entropy, I think it's only quid pro quo for me to suffer through Selfish Gene. And it is good for education.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would hope that you would want to read it because I've endorsed it, because you think that I am the kind of person who understands enough about creationism to be able to recognize when something would be worthwhile for you to read, and I wouldn't waste your time by recommending it.
No, I mean, because I think there are other people that share your views, and I'm needing to connect with a little bit more of the popular literature. One reason I haven't read it, I really don't read a lot of popular literature, even creationist literature. There was something.
There's a scholarly counterpart to it called The Extended Phenotype, if you want a scholarly work, but it's a lot drier and more boring.
Okay. No, I mean, I think that was. Oh, now I know what I wanted to say. Actually, if you'd asked me which book I'd recommend, it would have been Change Tan and Rob Stadler's book, Stairway to Life.
Okay.
In fact, that is the foundation of the kind of the series of books John and Dr. Sanford and I hope to write. We're actually going to be pointing to that as the kind of the first stairway in our project called the Stairways to Understanding.
I actually considered reading that one, but as far as I could tell from reading reviews and blurbs, that wasn't really talking about evolution. That was talking more about taking on more the problem of abiogenesis, which I've already conceded is a problem. And so,
well, it's not. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, please.
What I wanted to say is, they convinced me as I read, because it was written by some really sharp people. That wasn't an argument from ignorance as creationist.
No, abiogenesis, an argument against abiogenesis, not an argument against evolution.
Correct. That is correct. It is an abiogenesis. It's not an evolution.
I don't need to read it. I'm happy to concede that there are valid arguments calling abiogenesis into doubt.
Well, if it's in doubt, I mean, where I was headed with that is that would be persuasive enough for me that there was a miracle. So the question is, hypothetically, if we don't see a miracle with our own eyes and experience it with our own senses, at what point does each person decide that they're willing to say, how improbable does something have to be before we, in our hearts, would consider it a miracle?
Yep.
And everyone has a different
so let
set
me
of
just
criteria.
explain why I'm putting my money on not miracle, or at least on the not supernatural miracle. I mean, the word miracle can be used in sort of a metaphorical sense to mean the occurrence of some extremely unlikely event, but still from natural causes. And I believe abiogenesis was that kind of a miracle. Can't prove it, but the reason I'm putting my money on that side of the table is because there's a very long history of people looking at seemingly unexplainable natural phenomena and saying, because I don't understand it today, it must be the work of the gods. Starting with, things like lightning and floods and plagues. And science has a very good track record of explaining things that at some point or another in human history were considered to be unexplainable. So I just go on that track record, and that's why I put my faith in science. But freely concede that it's an article of faith.
The reason I smiled when you said that, I'll take those odds. And
that's fine. So. I mean, one of the things that the reason that I started studying this, like I said, in the first place, is to try to come to understand how smart people can come to believe this. And I actually think that I've more or less figured it out. My current theory about the division between creationists and frankly everybody else is that creationists take teleology as primary. They start with the assumption that their own existence has to have some purpose and meaning, and they reason from there. And one of the reasons that I have sort of a grudging respect for YCs is that they take their conclusions much more seriously than other religious people. So their reasoning goes something like, there must be some purpose, and that purpose probably was built into the fabric of the universe when it was created by whatever created it. And that creator probably left some kind of a clue for me as to what that purpose was. And the most likely manifestation of that clue is the Bible. And therefore, the Bible is reliable. And therefore, the earth must be young, because if you look at what the Bible says, that's the logical conclusion that you reach. Would you agree with that theory? Do you think that that's at all on the right track?
Yeah, I can't really speak for anyone else except myself, and I get in trouble if I speak for other people. So I'll speak for myself. Is it a fair
characterization of your own beliefs?
I would say it's not exactly my.
Okay, is it anywhere close to the mark?
Yes.
Okay, how would you correct it?
There comes a point when something seems improbable enough that I would attribute it to a deity. I mean, because everyone has their limit, and I've talked to some atheists, and I said, well, okay, I'll just share a personal example. I met astronaut Charles Duke, who was the youngest man to walk on the moon. When he came back to the Earth, his life was a mess. His wife wanted to commit suicide, but she became a Christian, and then he became a Christian, and then he prayed over a blind young girl, and she got...
Sal, I'm sorry to interrupt, and I want you to finish the story. We're just getting word from the chat that people just wanted to stay on topic, especially in regards to, the topic being genetic entropy and mutations and natural selection, and if natural selection is capable of removing that which is nearly neutral, for example. So can we just keep this on topic? It's not just myself,
sure.
But
can I finish my story?
I think Ron's doing a good job keeping it on topic.
I apologize, because I'm the one who led us off on this tangent, and the reason I did that is because I'm tuned into live comments here, and I don't see anything coming through. So I didn't realize that people were interested in this. But let me just say about the way that selection works. A lot of the things that that Sal and Sanford are saying are true. It is true that most mutations at the molecular level are neutral. It is true that some mutations at the molecular level are catastrophically bad and will kill the organism. But if you think about it, a mutation that is so catastrophically bad that it kills the organism before it can reproduce is self-correcting. Such a mutation will never be able to propagate into the gene pool because the organism in which it happens dies before it can reproduce. And that's exactly how evolution works. So the neutral mutations propagate because they're neutral. And the really bad mutations get eliminated immediately because they can't reproduce at all. And then everything else happens in gray levels in between. Things that are slightly beneficial propagate more than things that are slightly deleterious. And by the way, benefit and harm have to be measured relative to the environment in which they occur, because there are some things that are beneficial in some environments that are harmful in the same mutation can be beneficial in some environments and harmful in other environments. And so it's not that evolution optimizes for anything. Evolution doesn't optimize, it satisfices. And it finds good enough solutions to maintain reproductive fitness in various environments. And that's why it fills all these niches with lots of different kinds of solutions. And by the way, in so doing, creates new niches where new kinds of things can survive. I give the example of Chihuahuas in my review of Sanford's book. In today's world, Chihuahuas are reproductively successful because they've endeared themselves to humans. And if humans weren't here, Chihuahuas probably wouldn't either. Wolves is exactly the opposite. So wolves are by some naive measure superior to Chihuahuas in every way. They're stronger, they're faster, they're bigger, they have sharper teeth. But there are probably more Chihuahuas in the world than there are wolves because there are humans. And if humans were to go extinct someday, which they very well could, then the tide would probably turn in favor of the wolves because the environment would have changed.
I think those are some really good points there, Ron. So it sounds like you're saying in regards to beneficial mutations, there's a trade-off to be had. They're environmentally dependent. One may be deleterious in one way, but beneficial in another. And your other point sounds like it has to do with artificial selection when it comes to a lot of the domestic dogs we see versus those in the wild, like wolves, right?
Sure.
So if Sal, if you could take some time addressing those points, and then I think this is a really good place to start. So I thank you for bringing those points up, Ron. And this is exciting. So Sal, go ahead if you could address those points.
If I could share my screen. I have the screen share up. So these are the slides I prepared for my 10-minute talk. I actually had more, and it will address why I think natural selection is insufficient to create organs like this. So I will agree that natural selection selects for reproductive fitness. The problem is it doesn't select for fitness in the physics or mechanical sense. Nor can it, because of the examples like this one of the potassium ion channel or anything else where there has to be a complex arrangement of basically the spelling of the protein to be able to create a new structure that is perfectly fit. And so when I was covering this potassium channel that has to have this exact fit, and I was saying the reason, we can try to have a genetic algorithm man-made that will try to run a computation to try to solve. If we just gave it the problem making a potassium channel, we could just keep running it forever. An organism isn't going to be wasting those resources. And that's why I was saying we can't invoke natural selection as a solution to complex proteins like the potassium channel or many other. There are millions of proteins out there spread across many species. And even when I'm covering just kind of the geometric shape here, where fitness really means physical fit, as in connection. I didn't even cover like the translocon processing, which is way beyond the scope of this. But the point is that any variation to this protein here, you can see if it's already optimized to process a potassium ion, any changes to it, it's either going to be at best not that harmful or bad. There's not really a lot of room as far as that architecture for it to change. So that's why this distribution in Dr. Sanford's book is by and large correct. If we define fitness in terms of reproductive success, that misses the point. It can't then be connected to why there are very well fine-tuned structures like this. That's what I was trying to get at. The fine-tuning of,
but it can.
I don't believe so. That's
Okay.
probably where we will disagree.
Can I explain how?
Yeah. Finally, we have a disagreement. Okay.
Okay. So I have to say this argument is new to me. I've not had a chance to really study it. It's possible there's some merit in it, but the conclusion as you presented it simply does not logically follow that selecting for reproductive fitness cannot result in a selection for some kind of mechanical fitness, whatever that actually means. I don't know what it means.
I think
but it could just turn out that the things that you call mechanically fit are the things that you need in order to produce reproductive fitness. And so selecting for reproductive fitness also selects for mechanical fitness as a side effect.
Well, maybe the way I could frame it is I would argue natural selection prevents evolution of complex features because the intermediates are dead. So in genetic algorithms, you have things like fitness peaks where something's trapped at a fitness peak. The fitness landscape of physics doesn't really change. It either is going to arrive at this solution or it's not. It's not like things will change. And I mean, some of this is almost like you'd have to change the laws of physics to really change the fitness landscape. There are only certain solutions that can arrive at this sub-angstrom precision. And that's one reason I'm emphasizing a lot of the creationists I know are kind of in the structural biology realm. They, you know, when we talk about these things evolving, it's just hard for them personally to believe that natural selection could resolve this. So if I could continue a little bit, this is an example of, this is from Bruce Albert's Essential Cell Biology. This was my cell biology textbook, freshman level. This is the protein on the left and the protein on the right. They are nicely shaped for each other and they can dock, they can connect with each other. And you'll notice that the plus charges align with the minus charges. That's how the specificity, how well the connection has to be for some of these protein interactions to be that they line up. For this to happen in a coherent way, they both have to be simultaneously. I'll explain why shortly. There are other, by the way, there are other fitting machines like this one, the ATP Synthase. These are the ATP Synthase machines. More and more of these fitting machines. And the way that these structures are created, they're not milled. They have to be spelled, and it creates a certain fold. And when we get the right spelling, that's how we get the fold.
So this is all starting to sound like Behe's irreducible complexity argument. Is that what this is, or is this something new? Because Behe I am familiar with and can...
Yes, this is very similar to his, and I don't like the use of the word irreducible complexity.
Why not?
Interconnectability is better because biology has lots of things where you can reduce the complexity. You can do the same thing with fewer parts, and people have...
Okay.
So that wasn't the best choice.
So there's a creationist argument evolving before our very eyes.
Yes. Well, see, this is the reason I put this out there is I want creationists to study the protein structure and understand it more, because this is where I was headed with this. This structure here, let me see if I have it. I had a picture of this. Thank you for bearing with me as I get this up. You see these different colored proteins here? That's actually the same protein spelled several times, and I'll describe this a little more. So if I had like a hypothetical protein,
sorry to interrupt, but maybe do you think you guys can be more on topic, more on the genetic entropy part of it, not necessarily complexity and...
Well, I'm sorry. This is. I know people may feel that, but I'm trying to explain why this is genetic entropy.
Oh, okay.
If they understand protein structure, they'll understand where genetic entropy comes from.
Especially Sal, if we can, if you finish your explanation, pertain it to genetic entropy, and then we'll give Ron, because, for example, when Ron was talking about a trade-off in artificial selection, for example, those were a couple of good points. So if you can make a point that Ron will disagree with, and I know that's what you're doing here, but also bring it back around and kind of relate it to genetic entropy, and then we'll give Ron the opportunity to kind of object to that and refute that. We'll keep it at the meat and potatoes now for the last 30 minutes.
So, but this is actually the genetic entropy argument framed in terms of hardware. That's what I was trying to go through. I think some of the people familiar with John Sanford's book are expecting me to explain it a certain way. This is through a different process.
Do you mind if I take a whack at it?
Yeah.
So here is the argument as I understand it. And it goes something like this. There are these proteins that are incredibly complicated. And if you change them even a little bit, then they lose their function. And because of that, there's no possible way that they could have been built up incrementally. The entire structure of the protein has to have come into being all at once in order for the function that this protein does to work. Is that something close to what you're trying to get at?
That's close, but not exactly.
Okay, what have I missed?
We wouldn't even need to argue genetic entropy to talk about the improbability of the protein to begin with. We could just take it directly with Behe's irreducible complexity. We don't have to conflate it with genetic entropy. Genetic entropy would follow from Behe, not the other way around. But what I was trying to illustrate here I was trying to illustrate the connection of the proteins. So if I hypothetically made 4 proteins, like they might be able to connect in one complex, and we call this a quaternary structure. So I'm sorry that the audience may be wanting me to make points that are simple for them, but I would wish I would spend a little more time studying a little bit. I'm trying to give you the molecular biology you need to make these arguments.
Well, Sal, do you feel with your responses to Ron's points regarding a trade-off and beneficials, and because Ron, again, you're pretty much boiling it down to the fact that beneficials, although rare, can at the end of the day counterbalance the deleterious mutations that may or may not be accumulating in our genetics. Is that kind of more or less what your point would be?
I think phrasing it that way misses the crucial point, which is that the whole premise that something can be ancestral or deleterious on some absolute scale, that is completely wrong. No mutation can be assessed in terms of its benefit on any absolute scale, except for the ones that kill the organism before it's able to reproduce.
Right.
Those are clearly deleterious.
Right.
But everything else is potentially beneficial in some circumstance.
Right.
I'll give you some concrete examples. So the mutations that create antibiotic resistance in bacteria generally leave those bacteria at a competitive disadvantage to the bacteria that don't have these mutations, unless there's an environment where there are antibiotics, in which case those win. An example in humans, the mutation that produces sickle cell disease. It's a gene that if you only have one of them, it gives you resistance to malaria. And if you have 2 of them, you get sickle cell disease. So if you have this mutation, you're kind of rolling the dice on getting sickle cell disease, which is bad. But if you live someplace where, then rolling those dice could still be a net win.
Well, and what I wanted to say is the reason I'm going over this is I'm trying to show why we can't correlate. The whole point before I got interrupted by some of the complaints in the audience that this isn't genetic is that the structure will decorrelate the whole thing of natural selection versus functional fitness. This is an example of functional fitness. It's very difficult to arrive at these solutions. That's why I was pointing out the problem with protein folding. These are not things that can be. It's like if we had a tornado going through a junkyard, it can easily create paperweights. It cannot create very integrated, interconnected structures, such as the one, by way of analogy, random mutation might make some random enzyme. It doesn't make very good connections like this. And the other thing is where I was leading with that before the audience started complaining, and I'm sorry to not satisfy the audience, but I'm going to just speak from my conscience here, whether they like it or not. So for once, I'm going to show a little bit of spine and say, I'm just going to say what I think and speak my conscience. I'm not going to cater to what people want to hear, or that I'll frame it the way that they expect me to, or if they're complaining, I'm not making the argument the way that they would like. I'm going to make it the way that I think has to be taught. So for a change, I'm going to stand up a little bit, and I'm going to offend some people. So we have a signaling pathway like this in the cell. This is only one of a few. In each of these exchanges, it's going to have all those partner relationships. One on the receiving end here when it's a receiver, and then one on the sending end. And there are many of these connections there. These are like passwords. These passwords face what they call the waiting time problem of evolving. And these are the barriers. It's just like trying to solve a password by, if you forget your password, the system doesn't say you're getting warm, you're getting close, and starts to lead you there. The reason that the password has to be doing enough sufficient discrimination is that it's bad to have kind of these promiscuous interactions, because you don't want these little proteins interacting with the wrong protein. So as a matter of principle, they have to be just different enough. We're talking about, say, maybe I see numbers on the order of about 10 amino acids. So when we look at some of the other protein interaction diagrams, we have things that look like this. So this is, maybe in the space of this time, and I'm going to stop sharing, we can't maybe resolve this argument very clearly, because this is in depth, but I think at least Ron represented what I was trying to say accurately, that I'm decorrelating what we call natural selection with the fitness at the physical realm in terms of connections. I'm saying that those connections, because of the difficulty of the protein folding problem, natural selection cannot resolve that. And in fact, natural selection would prevent and preclude us from resolving those protein structures. And that's what I was really trying to explain, especially to the audience by the way, thank you for all those who still gave a super chat, even though I disappointed you.
How much time do we have left? Hello?
Yes, we got 10 minutes. I was about to jump in there and tell you guys that.
Just trying to decide how to respond to that in the time we still have available. I guess I will go back to my earlier disclaimer that I'm not a biologist and I have not read up on these arguments, and so I can't really respond to them in detail. And it's possible that if I dug into them, there would turn out to be some merit there. I'll give you long odds against, but
I think that's fair. I wanted to say I think that's fair, and same on my end. And I could always work on these things more. I will say this: when I showed this to Dr. Sanford, he was very enthusiastic. That's why he wanted me to work on this and to publish it, because it is kind of the new frontier. He felt these were more cogent arguments.
Let me say one more thing though, which is that all of these arguments strike me as arguments from incredulity. The form of the argument still feels to me, despite the fact that I don't understand the details, feels to me like an argument of the form, I don't understand how this could possibly work, and therefore it must be a miracle. And to that, I can only say that there are a lot of examples that I could show you of incredibly complicated things that when you first encounter them, you really don't understand how they could possibly work, and yet they are understandable. And I can give you some very concrete examples of that. There's also, there are all kinds of sort of meta arguments about there's some very interesting mathematical results and computational results about the limits of things that can be known and can be proven. And one of those is something called Chaitin's theorem, which essentially says that you can never prove that something is irreducibly complex. And this doesn't directly get at genetic entropy, but it gets at the general form of an argument that says this is so complicated that it can never possibly be understood. Chaitin's theorem says that you can never prove a claim of that form because it's always possible that there is some underlying simple explanation. You just haven't found it yet. So all of these arguments are always on shaky grounds, and we can mathematically prove that they will always be on shaky grounds. But maybe we should use that as a setup and a teaser for a sequel that give me a chance to actually study some molecular biology, and we can come back and mix it up again.
Well, I think that would be extremely valuable. I think all of us would benefit from seeing things from the hardware perspective of how things connect, and because that's what I was tasked to do, is to study what the NIH is researching. And I see all these signaling pathways and I see all these connections. And so when you said this sounds like an argument from incredulity, I would say it's more like an argument from contradiction. Argument from contradiction is similar to proof by contradiction, but it's not quite as strong. So I'll say argument from contradiction is like, I would not expect all the connections to be in place if a tornado passed through a junkyard to make a 747. That was actually not a creationist who said that. That was Fred Hoyle, who's kind of an atheist ID proponent. And so I'm just saying this is an argument for contradiction. But then more specifically, there is a theoretical issue that has come up, whether we can frame natural selection as being adequate to create physically kind of the fitness in the we may have to come up with a new term, the optimization of connections in the physical realm, which is physical fitness in this sense of connection. Can it fitness in the natural, in the evolutionary definition? And that's something we've been working through over since January. We said there's no connection here. We found evolutionary biologists who said, who've quietly criticized the idea, most especially Richard Lewontin. So when you're saying this is going to the core, that's exactly what we were trying to do with our publications, is that we're trying to highlight these problems. So this, as you said, the creationist arguments are evolving. This is kind of the more virulent form we're hoping.
5 minutes.
But so Ron, you have the last word, and I appreciate you bearing with me, and I want to thank the audience for bearing with me, even though I was boring. That's probably why I'm not going to be much on the debate circuit. I'm more of a lecturer than I am than a boxer.
I guess I will take the last word then to thank our hosts and thank the audience for this opportunity. In preparation for this, I watched a couple of previous debates that had taken place on this channel. And in particular, I watched one between Kent Hovind and Aaron Ra. And I was a little bit appalled by the tenor of that debate. It was like watching a schoolyard brawl more than a scholarly debate. And I was hoping very much this wouldn't be like that, and it hasn't been. And so I thank you for a constructive and interesting exchange, and for the opportunity to appear here, for hosting these. I really appreciate it. And everybody in the audience, whoever you are, thanks for listening.
Awesome. I appreciate that. I think the one you're referring to was on a different channel called the Non Sequitur Show, Aaron Ra, Ken Hovind. You're right. That was a schoolyard brawl. Yeah. I would not advocate for I would say that debate was pretty poorly moderated. But you're right. Yeah, this was a very scientific, intellectual dialogue, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think for the most part the audience did as well. To be honest with you, it's flown by. So we do have concluding statements, but if you guys did want to, so I guess you just had the last word there, Ron, unless you got something else to say. We can also let Sal wrap things up as well as a form of a concluding statement. We do got some questions we can get to quick as well, and then kind of go from there.
Let's do questions.
I do have some concluding remarks.
Okay.
And, if I'll go first, Ron, and
I don't have concluding remarks, but
Okay.
I'd love to hear questions.
Okay. So my concluding remarks, every major geneticist on the planet is in agreement that we should be concerned for the human genome. I know of no one that thinks the human genome is improving. All of them are concerned that it is deteriorating at an alarming rate. And the irony is some of these people have been suggesting, okay, if not eugenics, we also need maybe a program of genetic engineering. And I said, this is very ironic that the very evolutionary biologists and population geneticists that argue against intelligent design have said, basically, unwittingly perhaps, that to save our genomes, we need to re-engineer them, which is intelligent design. And to me, that right there, independent of whether Dr. Sanford or myself have argued genetic entropy for humans, whether we've argued it effectively or not, I think we are faced with the prospects that we are deteriorating and we're in trouble. And this is something all of us will have to consider as a human species, and where we will put our faith and trust. And it raises questions about, many ultimate questions in people like myself. So I do think that part of the genetic entropy thesis is really not without, has not been assailed in any way. Yes, it may bring questions about creation and evolution, which is strictly separate, but that is my understanding of things. So thank you.
I will actually make a quick closing remark, if I may, because we actually I do agree with that. It's true that the human genome is deteriorating in some sense of the word, in the sense that there are mutations in the human population today that would not have survived in our ancestral environment. And in that sense, we're getting weaker because we're not able to survive in as stringent an environment as we used to be able to. Personally, I think that's a good thing because we're able to engineer our environment in such a way that allows these mutations to survive when before they would have just died. So where you see doom and gloom and extinction, I see progress. But we're not actually in disagreement about the fundamental dynamics of what's going on there. When you remove selective pressure, which is what we've done by engineering our environment, more mutations that previously in the old environment would have been deleterious are able to survive. That is a fact.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I really appreciate how respectful you guys kept it. It's been a good debate, and we've had a really large audience tonight, so people are excited to hear you guys talk. And sure, maybe there was one or two complaints to keep it on topic, but that's expected when there's an audience of that size. Because for the most part, I can speak for the moderators as well. We've enjoyed the debate, and it's flown by. And better yet, we've got a lot of good questions too. So
bring them on.
Yeah. Sorry, if people were hoping for a gladiator fight. That's just not who we are.
It was a great debate. No complaints here. So let's get right to the questions then. We've got I've saved as many as I could, so I may not be going in order. If I miss somebody, then just re-tag me. Okay, so first question is from Landon Freeman. Thank you, Landon. And I apologize, Ron. There's a lot of Young Earth Creationists in the chat. So
me when that blind girl was healed in the name of Jesus, even though it was just his personal test, enough for me. Maybe it's not enough for someone else, but that was plenty for me, enough for me to stay in the Christian faith and pursue Jesus with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength.
Awesome. Thanks, Sal. A final word there, Ron?
Nope.
Okay, awesome.
Nothing to add.
Okay, let's go. Next question is from Luca. Thanks for the question there, Luca. He says for Sal. So Sal, he says, you think that proteins in cells are breaking? Okay, so I'll word it differently just so you understand it better. So do you think that proteins in cells are breaking any laws of physics? They are acting odd by chemistry laws. If yes, how?
No, I don't believe they're breaking laws of physics. They're able to exploit the laws of physics as detailed by William Bialec's book. William Bialec, the Princeton biophysicist I quoted earlier. What would have, it's not the proteins that exist now. What I'm saying is that a law of physics was broken in the origin of life. That's the abiogenesis event. And since creationists believe, especially young Earth creationists believe that life was created all at once, all or nothing, pretty much in 6 days, especially the young Earth creationists, that was a breaking of physics. So the creation was the breaking of the laws, not the operation today. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, good job. Ron, if you had a response.
Yeah, so the application of the genetic entropy argument to creationism, as I understand it, is that because genes necessarily deteriorate in this fuzzily defined way, that it must be the case that all of the useful functionality must have been there from the very beginning, because we're just losing functionality as time goes by. And eventually all life is going to go extinct that way. And that's the reason that genetic entropy is taken as evidence for creationism. The flaw with that argument is that it neglects the effects of environmental selection.
If you had a response there, Sal. It was your question, so you can have the last word there.
Oh, thank you. I'd say certain creatures are way more at risk than others, and it was Herman Muller and a lot of the population geneticists that were concerned, especially for humans, because the reproduction rate is, it's limited. It's not even if we had 3 mutations per generation per individual, each female would have to give birth to about at least 40 kids, according to their calculations. This is past the Muller's limit. There's something with the Poisson distribution, and we don't need to go there. But so what Ron said was the genetic entropy argument of the proteins and the systems in biology have been slowly deteriorating. It would be the most pronounced in higher organisms like humans or birds or etc. And that's the argument for the young life, toward a young life creationism. That when if we were going to try to say when did the creation event happen, it couldn't have been too far back. And this was even what Alexei Kondrashov, who's not a creationist, he even raised the rhetorical question: why aren't we dead 100 times over? Why aren't we dead 100 times over? So again, even though it may seem like an argument from incredulity, it's not solely a concern that came from creationist quarters. Dr. Sanford, having been taught by evolutionists through his training and being in Cornell when he was a non-Christian for a long time, he was aware of these things. He's just had the chance to articulate the things that the concerns that were raised before he became a Christian. He's now articulating it from the other side. Now being a creationist, he's feeling free now to talk about it. So I think Ron did articulate the argument accurately. Even though he doesn't agree, he did articulate it accurately.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer there, Sal. And thanks to the audience as well for giving us so many good questions. Okay, so next one is from George Bond. Thanks so much for your super chat. Question is for Ron. What in the Bible convinced you the Bible wasn't from God? Go ahead, Ron.
Oh, goodness, where to begin? I could talk for an hour just about that, but I guess I'll just give you one example from Genesis. There are the first 2 chapters of Genesis give 2 separate creation accounts, and they contradict each other. So in the first account, animals are created before man, and in the second account, man is created first, and then animals are created in an unsuccessful attempt to find somebody to keep man company. So that's just one of many, many, many things in the Bible that I've found that just make absolutely no sense to me if it's the Word of God.
Well, thanks for that response there, Ron. Sal, if you had a response to that.
I do relate to Ron as far as saying that the more I read the Bible, there was a phase in my life, the less I believed it for a while. And I nearly left the church 20 years ago. The one thing that brought me back, ironically, was when I nearly left the church, was hanging out with atheists and talking about evolutionary theory and abiogenesis theory. And it was through that process I concluded that we are created and live in a cursed world. So at least the essential themes of the Bible, that we're intelligently designed, but also live in a world that's cursed, it at least gave me the most, it made me feel like Genesis was telling it like it is. So Ron will say this frequently to me, and I think Ron wouldn't mind me repeating this. He's been fascinated that both he and I have such a similar temperament and approach to things, but arrived at completely different conclusions. And so when he describes things, I can sympathize, but I've arrived at different conclusions.
Awesome. And since the question was for you, Ron, you can have the last word.
I don't really have anything to add. And anybody who's really interested in this, I am happy to talk about it, but it just would take much too long to get into. Maybe we could do a whole nother session on this if you want.
Yeah, so I had actually had a question maybe you guys both could address. So we have actually research papers of, I think, genetic decline. For one example would be the decline of the human IQ. And I think Harvard put that out. There's a paper by Harvard. But also there's thousands of genetic disorders. So Ron, would you consider that an example of genetic entropy? And if you did not, what would you say that is?
No, I've already conceded that the human genome is in some sense deteriorating, in the sense that there are mutations that survive in today's environment that would not have survived in our ancestral environment. So, by that measure, yes, the genome is getting weaker. But again, personally, I consider that progress, because we've changed our environment in such a way that allows members of our species to survive who wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that's a good thing.
You can respond to that, Sal, if you wanted to, if you're familiar with that.
Yeah. Well, the question, I mean, it's understandable that we might be attributing this loss of this deterioration of the genes to the improvement of environmental conditions and medical care. I would say it accelerated what was a decline that was already there. Again, that was what Kondrashov was bothered with, and it's also bothered a lot of geneticists. They are troubled by these questions. So as much as some of the opponents of creationism want to frame genetic entropy as Dr. Sanford's idea, it is not. He's just getting flack for it because he is connecting the dots.
Well, he literally wrote the book.
Yeah, because he wrote the book. But he's connecting the dots. I mean, I know the evolutionists are worried about this because you can just read it in their literature. If someone like Kondrashov, who worked at the NIH, says, "Why aren't we dead 100 times over?" It's bothering people because they know this. And when Dan Grauer comes out and says, "If ENCODE is right, evolution is wrong," the thing that really struck me is he should have. You would think that biologists would be excited to see all the incredible designs that are in the human genome. Just like the biophysicists love it. They love it when they see more just amazing things that humans can't do that biology can do. The one group of people that were really offended when there was any even hint that biology was engineered in ways that we couldn't engineer were the evolutionary biologists. So I'm just saying, I'm noticing that this concern of why we're still alive, it's floating around. It's in the back of people's minds, and thankfully, some of these concerns have been expressed in the literature. And I'll just an anecdote. I have a radio interview that Dr. Sanford granted and said I could publish. He said before he became a Christian, when his PhD advisor, one of his professors, said, one of the biggest problems in evolutionary biology is the problem of mutational load, which is one of the complications that would create genetic entropy. And when Dr. Sanford became a Christian, that hung with him and he pursued it. And that's where the book came out. So it's not like this was in a corner. It's lurking there. And that's why evolutionary biologists like Dan Grauer got so upset, which was kind of almost comical. It's like he was so angry that the human genome's doing great things. I just found that really comical.
Awesome. Well, really good answers from the both of you. I really appreciate this. So let me see here. I'm going to find a question. So I guess that one was for both of you. I think the one before that was for Ron. So let's see if
there
okay,
were a
so
couple
here's
of
one
super chats.
for
SF, if you can read those super chats.
all right, yeah. Okay, so we've got Shadow Dancer super chat. Thank you so much. She says, "Cheers, Salvador. Good job tonight." If you'd like to respond there, Sal, you got a fan.
Oh, thanks, Shadow Dancer. Your name came up as a possible debate partner because Speed of Sound wants to debate me, and the debate organizer said you need to get partners. So
2v2 tag team, making it interesting, eh? Okay, well, yeah, thanks for the super chat there, Shadow Dancer. This one is from John Wick. Doesn't really specify who it's for. You both can tackle it if you'd like. He says, "Didn't Lenski prove advanced evolution?" I assume he's referring to the long-term E. coli experiment. Why don't we whoever wants to answer that first, you can go ahead.
I have no idea.
I have
to look that up.
I have a little idea. I will say this: Scott Minnick, who has been known to support ID, what took Lenski's lab about 30,000 generations, he was able to do in 12 days. So this was kind of funny. The irony is a quote unquote creationist was able to evolve his bacteria so much faster than an evolutionist. That's all about I know about it.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that response. I know Logos RA, that website has, I think it's actually a paper, maybe more so an article by Dr. Sanford himself on that, going into detail. So if anyone from the audience is interested in that. Next question would be from Jesus Paid It All. Thanks for the question. This one is, he does. Okay, so for Sal, how does Sal deal with synergistic epistasis, which seems to halt genetic entropy? Take your time.
Not even Dan Grauer will invoke synergistic epistasis. Synergistic epistasis is the idea, let me try to put this in kind of everyday terms. And Ron will probably appreciate this because he's a pilot like me. And when we're flying airplanes, it's really good if you have a dual ignition system, if you have piston engines, where you have at least two sets of spark plugs in case one electrical system fails. And if one system fails, you could still fly, thank God. If both, you crash. I mean, your engine goes. So synergistic epistasis means that when one gene fails, it's not too bad. When two go, it gets really strongly expressed. That in itself will only it'll make a mutation that is somewhat neutral to be very deleterious. It doesn't guarantee that we will have enough excess population to get rid of the bad mutations. So this is subject to numerical simulation, the thing that I'll point out is Dan Grauer does not appeal to that mechanism to rescue the problem of ENCODE. He basically said if ENCODE is right, evolution is wrong. So there'd be a side of evolutionists who would probably side with Kondrashov and say, well, ENCODE could be right if synergistic epistasis is in play. So even among evolutionary biologists, there's not uniform agreement on whether it even works. And it's still purely speculative and theoretical. But that's, they're having to come up with rescue mechanisms like this because they recognize that this is a severe problem. The way that we'll resolve these issues, and kind of in a sad way, and I'm really, this is when I actually hope I'm wrong, is that as we start to sequence the DNA of humans, and we're expecting very large numbers being sequenced because we're studying heritable diseases, numbers like, just think, the first time we sequenced one complete genome, that was $4 billion. Now we can sequence a complete genome for, say, about 3,000. It may even get cheaper. So we'll have millions and millions of genomes now that we can track from grandmother to granddaughter. We'll have an idea of whether synergistic epistasis is rescuing us or whether our deterioration is too fast and can't be arrested. So some of these open questions will have resolution. And it's one of those things, it's like, there was, I guess the line from the movie, it's like, do I always have to be right? Because all these bad things happen. And so that's the best that I could answer. And I'd like to thank the gentleman who fielded the question. That's a good one.
Awesome. I really appreciate that response. Sal, very well said. Ron, did you have a response at all?
I've heard you invoke this slogan, if ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong, a number of times. I've heard it from other people too. What is ENCODE?
Okay, no, this is a really good question. The NIH, Francis Collins had the Human Genome Project where they found out what all the DNA letters were, or 99% or so in a human genome. Even though we're slightly different, he found what we call the consensus. But they said we don't actually know what it all does because only about 2% provide the blueprints for the proteins. It's like, well, what does the rest of the DNA, what's the rest of it used for? And in the 70s, someone by the name of Ono, who used, and I referred to the Mueller's limit of about one mutation per generation per individual is all that we can tolerate. They extended that and said, well, we could only have a certain number of genes, and that would equate to a certain percentage of the genome that could be functional. Because the more, I guess the way to say it is, the more functionality you have, the more ways it can break. I mean, that's kind of a crude way of saying it. And they said that the limit has to be about maybe 5% could be functional, and the rest has to be junk. So that's where they came up with the term junk DNA. It came from Susumu Ono in the 1970s. And this is based on all the theoretical work. And again, that's what influenced Dr. Sanford, even before he became a Christian, he was hearing about this. So they said, well, this has to be junk. And what ENCODE discovered was what they claimed. Okay, they haven't fully discovered it. I think it's other projects thereafter. After ENCODE, they began examining, they began to look at what the other DNA did rather than code for proteins, what that other 98% did. So they found a few things. One thing that had always motivated them is 90% of heritable diseases are indicated in the non-coding regions, the very regions that the evolutionary biologists insisted on junk. And yet the medical researchers are saying, no, this is affecting the disease I'm studying. That's prima facie evidence. That's at least first glance evidence that DNA is doing something. And ENCODE was pursuing it. And they did a whole bunch of experiments that are really nerdy to talk about, like ChiaPet and these methylation things and histone modifications and a whole bunch of DNase. I can't even name it. And they just cataloged it. And they said, it does look like the the DNA is being transcribed. It's being used for something we don't know exactly what. We think it's 80% functional, maybe even 100%. And because this was egg on the face of a certain segment of the evolutionary biology community, they just went ballistic. They just went ballistic because they are staking so much of the reputation that that the human genome is badly designed. That, you know, if it looks like it's well, on a philosophical level, if it's competently designed, that suggests the designer, especially if it's ingeniously designed. That's the philosophical level. On the scientific level, they actually put like hard figures of how functional the genome would have to be, and it would have to be like only like 2 to 10%. If you get up to 10% functionality, even Dan Grauer, his publication, even with his estimates of 10%, every human female would have to bear about 44,000 offspring just to be able to have one child that is free of a bad mutation. That's just really straight from the Poisson distribution. It's the math is not that deep, but that's something that they're aware of. And as far as I know, it's still they haven't come to agreement on how to deal with this, because you have one set of evolutionary biologists like Grauer who said if ENCODE is right, evolution's wrong. And then they're the real diehards. And then you have the other set like Hondershaw. They're like, well, maybe we can find a fix for this, even though it looks kind of kludgy. So there have been follow-ons. Just to give you an idea of the size of the ENCODE project, my latest tally is they've invested about $500 million on this project. So it's not small change. And the follow-ons have been another $500 million. So we're almost up to $1 billion of investment into the research, because it's helping to find cures for cancer.
Awesome.
Beginning to be sorry I asked. Can I respond to that?
Of course. Yeah, go ahead.
My response to that is quick. Sometime in the 20th century, some aerodynamicist published a proof that bumblebees can't fly. And there are two possible explanations for this. One is that bumblebee flight is a miracle. Somehow there's some supernatural intervention, because manifestly bumblebees do fly. The other possibility is that this aerodynamicist got something wrong. I don't have to dig too deeply into the details to know which side I would place my bet on that.
I'll take that bet.
Okay, well, let's you know what, this is a super chat from Speed of Sound of Gravity, so thank you so much there, Speed. He's one of our biggest fans, actually. You know him.
Yeah.
Sal, he said that this was one of his favorite discussions that he's ever seen on this channel, and we've had a lot of discussions and debates, so
Thank you.
good job to the both of you guys. You got some fans out there, so you guys can say a couple words to that.
You
if
just
you'd
made
like.
my day. Thank you.
This is an interesting relationship. Speed of Sound is committed to fight creationism, but he's also my teacher of organic chemistry. So it's very interesting that I will humble myself before him, and he'll school me on chemistry and basic science, and then we will argue on creationism.
Am I the only one here who uses his real name? or are we the only ones using our real name?
Well, I'll say, just because we may disagree on a few things doesn't mean we can't all be friends. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, you guys have been awesome, and the conversation has been very intellectual, and we appreciate that. So, we got a lot of questions. So to be honest with you, I'll go through a few more. We probably won't have enough time to go through all of them, but let me see. I got one here from Jeremy at War. He says, for the evolutionists, so Ron, I assume that's you, unless you've converted recently there, Sal.
Yeah, still a good bet.
He says, which pseudogene sets are associated with brain cancer?
I have no clue.
No problem. No problem. So unless you had something to say, I can just go right on to the next one.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Super chat from Thermal 15. He didn't say anything, but he gave us a super chat. So thank you so much there. We really appreciate that. Another super chat from George Bond. Question is for Ron. He asked, why do you think aliens are a better explanation than God? Where did this alien come from?
Why do I think they're a better explanation than God? I'm not sure I do think that they're a better explanation than God. I bring them up mainly just to illustrate that there are other plausible hypotheses that that creationists never seem to even consider, and that they reject. I've never heard anyone give an actual argument as to why they reject that hypothesis. And I mostly throw that out there just kind of an idle observation about the structure of the reasoning rather than a really serious possibility. But I guess if you put a gun to my head and forced me to bet one way or the other, I would put my money on the aliens, because I can account for the existence of aliens in the same way that I can account for our own existence. And so I don't need to bend my worldview quite as far to get to aliens as I do to get to God. In fact, it's more surprising to me that we have not found aliens yet than it would be if we did. Aliens are what I would expect to find, and the fact that we haven't, that SETI failed to find them is actually kind of disturbing, and is another fact that demands explanation and that people are kind of scratching their heads about, including me.
Well, thank you for that answer there, Sal. If you had anything to add to that.
Yes, I do. My professor of quantum mechanics, James Trefil, he's a famous science writer too. Not quite as famous as Isaac Asimov, but still very well respected. He wrote the book, Are We Alone? And it's a very interesting, his conclusion is that we are very special and living on Earth, that he doesn't expect that there's any extraterrestrial life. And he's an opponent of ID. And this is really kind of funny. He had a creationist student in me. I seem to have a track record of having non-creationist teachers or anti-creationist teachers. But Dr. Trefil said something very interesting. He said, all that we've learned in the last 20 years, that was 20 years since he, before he wrote the book, he said, all that we've learned, if I were a religious man, I'd say that we are special in God's sight. And he was just observing how special the Earth is. And so his conclusion is that there are no aliens. And the book is Are We Alone? There are two books by that title, unfortunately. And one of them is by Rood and Trefil. That was my professor. So that's all I had to add. I just thought that was very interesting. He was also influential in making me reject the Big Bang, because he wrote a chapter in one of his popular books, The Galaxy Shouldn't Exist. And I found that very compelling. Even though he believes the Big Bang, he actually gave a lot of reasons to disbelieve it. And that led also to my Young Earth Creationism. So it's kind of interesting that it was my non-creationist professors that kind of made me think about the non-existence of aliens.
Well, thanks for that response there, Sal. The question was, it was for you, Ron, if you had and you can have the last word there if you'd like.
No, I pretty much said all I had to say about that.
Awesome. You guys are great. This question is from Speed of Sound of Gravity. Actually, it's more of a statement and sounds like it's for Sal. He's coming at you, Sal. He says, ENCODE is not talking about functionality, at least not anymore.
That may be true. Even if ENCODE is wrong, I think 4D Nucleome, their follow-on projects and the multiple follow-on projects could be demonstrating functionality. So I'm not specifically citing ENCODE. I'm citing the problem. What I meant, by the way, great to hear from you, Speed of Sound. You're a great guy. I still love you, even though you want to call me some really nasty names on our next debate from a Saturday Night Live skit. That's okay. When Grauer said if ENCODE is right, evolution is wrong, what he meant is if the genome is 80% functional, then evolution is wrong. Whether ENCODE was maybe premature or maybe arriving at the wrong conclusion, arriving at the right conclusion for the wrong reasons, that remains to be seen. I think at worst they arrived at the right conclusions for the wrong reasons. They were using a lot of what they call transcription data, differential transcription levels across cells, which isn't proof of itself. And I thought Dan Grauer actually made some good criticisms in his paper on immortal TV sets or something, which is a strangely named paper. But I do think there was one paper I wanted to share. I'll quote from it and why I think the 4D nucleome, the $500 million follow-ons. Let me see if I have one. It talked about the oh boy, I don't. If I could grab the juicy
in this lull, I just want to give you a heads up. I'm going to have to go fairly soon. I'm being summoned to dinner.
No problem.
Oh, here it is. I found it. So I'll let you go to dinner, Ron. This is it. The abstract reads, talking about kind of the 4D nucleome stuff. It's talking about the DNA acting as a three-dimensional random access memory, or an EEPROM. It says, these exotic properties necessitate modularizing three-dimensional genome into tree data on top of and in striking contrast to the linear topology of DNA double helix. And I'm sorry, that's just a boatload of technical terms, but the whole thing was talking about DNA as a massive hardware random access memory, in addition to be simultaneously a read-only memory. So I think speed of sound was correct to say, maybe ENCODE's not saying that it's functional, and that's fine. And I would agree with speed of sound there. I do think the question, it doesn't mean ENCODE was fundamentally wrong. Maybe they arrived at the correct conclusion the wrong way. And it's an open question how functional the genome is. And I'm just saying, I think it's really premature for anyone to be saying that it's functional or not. We just don't know. And that's why that's the fun thing about science. We can explore more things.
I appreciate that response there, Sal. Now, although I do have a lot more questions, I really only have one more that seems to be that seems to directly pertain to this debate. Ron, is it okay if I just ask that last question and then we'll call it a night?
Sounds good.
Okay, I appreciate that. I know how important dinner is too, no worries. So real quick then, we'll get this over with. From Whitekey9, thanks for your question. Question is for Sal. I'll just read it word for word. If you get to write that page for Dr. Sanford in 5E, what would your ideal definition of information going to sound like? Go ahead, Sal.
I don't have an ideal. Thank you for the question. And I don't have a definition for information because there's so many definitions out there and everyone has a different definition for it. That's one reason I'm trying to steer clear of it and go for hardware. I do like, I would tend to lean toward the way Ron with Shannon information. That's a very standard way of measuring it, but that, it's very hard to attach meaning to that. So, but that's really, engineers will agree on, the number of.
Why do you think attaching meaning to it is important?
Go on, Ron. You're the specialist on here, so I'm not going to object to you, but I wanted to hear what you had to say.
Well, no, you just said that you accept Shannon's definition of information, but that it's hard to attach meaning to it. And I presume that you said that because you thought it was relevant that you can't attach meaning to it. And I'm wondering what you mean by meaning and why you think that's important.
In the ID world, we think about, okay, for Shannon, we can even just say, because I was actually working through thermodynamic examples where we convert Joules Kelvin into Shannon bits. And we're just counting bits. We're not counting whether it has any content in the idea of meaning being like, say that wagon example in genetic entropy where Dr. Sanford's talking about an assembly an assembly instructions for a wagon, and he's saying you can't randomly mutate the characters and come up with an assembly instruction book to build a space shuttle. That's not exactly, I don't know how that fits in Shannon's theory. He's trying to convey the idea that random
Okay.
can't make meaningful
So
instructions.
just so we don't leave the audience with the wrong impression, I'm going to give you a 30-second crash course in Shannon information theory. In Shannon information theory, information is correlations between two systems. So the simplest example is if you have a light on the dashboard of your car that is on when the door is open and off when the door is closed, then the light contains information about the door because the states are correlated. And by the way, it's a bidirectional relationship. The door also contains information about the state of the light. Now, instructions are much more complicated than that, but because the way we're normally used to thinking about instructions is they're written out in natural language and humans read them, and the words on the page translate our brain translates that into actions. That's a very complicated process, and there is obviously some information at work there, but also lots of other really complicated things going on that confuse the issue. None of those things are going on at the cellular level. At the cellular level, it's a purely mechanical process of, as far as we know, of transcribing the information encoded in the DNA into proteins, which then go on and interact with each other in very complicated ways. There's nothing in there that I would think of as having any kind of meaning. And in fact, all of this was happening long before there were human brains. So that's why I ask you, what do you mean by meaning? Because that word doesn't naturally map onto any concept that I have in my head a priori.
And to the listener who asked the question, and it also relates to your comment, they were asking what would be my definition. I'd say avoid it like the plague, avoid information like the plague. The discussions go to the hardware, to the chemistry, and we'll have much more calm discussions, because otherwise they're going to be arguing. People have different definitions of what they think other people are talking about, and the arguments will just be shouting matches. But chemists can agree. That's one reason I can talk with someone like Speed of Sound. That's his handle. Because when we talk chemistry, we can agree on chemistry. When we start talking information and meaning, we're not going to agree. So that's why I'm trying to frame the genetic entropy argument, trying to pull it away from having to even deal with information. Because if you don't deal with it, you don't have to define it. So I feel that your contribution, your criticisms of Dr. Sanford's book have motivated me to be even more insistent that we're the next generation of books, at least that I author, maybe different from what he authors. And it'll be interesting because now we don't exactly agree, that I'll be very insistent we avoid the word information in a formal sense whatsoever.
I look forward to hearing the details of the hardware argument, but
you actually saw a little bit of it tonight.
Yeah, like I said, I predict you're going to find it's not going to get you out of the jam, but we'll see.
I'll take the bet.
So I'm sorry, I promised Anthony I would read this comment, so you guys you don't have to respond to this, you don't have to, but he says, Ron, controlled laboratory environments are successful because the hand of the intelligent chemist is controlling every step of the experiment, designing the genetic information. So that's his comment.
Okay.
Okay, well, gentlemen, I'll say it's been a blast. It's been 2 hours and it's flown by. Feels like it just started. So, I want to thank you both for giving us your time, because at the end of the day, if you didn't give us your time, we wouldn't have a debate today. So we don't want to keep you any longer there, Ron. You're probably getting...
Yeah, I really do have to go now, but thank you for having me. Let's do this again.
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you, Praise. Thanks. Thank you very much, Praise. Thank you, Standing for Truth.
My pleasure,
Thanks,
guys.
Ron.
Good
Our
good
pleasure.
discussion.
And thanks to the audience for all the questions. So yeah, we'll be calling it a night. Praise, you can shut her down, and Ron, you can get yourself some dinner. You've earned it. Good job. Good job to the both of you.
Thanks everyone in the chat and our participants. We're going to say good